There we go. Hello and welcome to the Collective Conspiracy Show, or as this little section is called, the COVID edition. This is the third and final episode that we're going to be doing on COVID. For the meanwhile, anyway, I feel like we've kind of hammered it now, and tonight we're going to be discussing what's happening or what could happen in the future, whether that be a good thing or a bad thing. And then we're going to go away, have a week off, and then come back with something else. Maybe we're going to discuss climate change. I think I know Andrew's keen on discussing that, so that could be a good thing to discuss. And it does, in our opinion, link closely to what's going on now. So climate change isn't just on its own. If you can hear that noise in the background, that's my frogs. So I apologise for that. But they've just eaten their flies and now they're all happy. So Bruce is running a bit late, as you can see. It's just myself and Andrew. So good evening, Andrew.
Good evening, Kieran.
Welcome back. It was nice to actually meet you Saturday. We met up at the demo in Birmingham for the Stand Up X demo.
Yeah.
You spoke. There was Piers Corbyn. There was Gareth Icke, son of David, of course. Jason Ioannidis, can't really pronounce his
Jason Leosatos, I think.
That's it. Yeah. And a Welsh man with a Greek name. And it was It was an all-round good day, good vibe, no nastiness, no unpleasantness. It was just a good, about 300, would you say?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, 200, 300 maybe. That's what I sort of guessed it at. It did seem to expand a little bit.
And what I found good was a lot of people were passing by and staying there. I noticed a lot of people were kind of coming to have a look what's going on, and then an hour later they were still there mixing with the crowd, and so that was quite nice to see. So to the guys just joining in, I can see you, everyone just joining in now. Thank you for tuning in, whether you're tuning in live or not. Please feel free to leave us a comment or to ask us questions as we go. Bruce is here now, so I'm just going to add him to the stream. Hi, Bruce.
Here.
There's Bruce. He's in a different position.
he's in a different room every time he comes on the show.
It's inherent.
Hello. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Bruce.
Yeah. I think you might need to put some headphones on, maybe.
He might, yeah.
Okay, so let's just we'll just carry on discussing until Bruce can jump in. So the one thing I'd really like to kick off with this episode is before we move on to what's going to happen in the future, is the gateway really between now and the future, and that is testing. And it seems that testing is effectively what's going to be putting us into the next lockdown, and they're encouraging it as much as ever. You mentioned something on Saturday, Andrew, at the demo about the PCR tests and about how they're actually not designed to test for a virus. The creator actually said as much himself. Could you just give us a bit of detail about that and really tell us and explain to us why what they're doing now is a complete waste of time, really?
Yeah, I'll try. I mean, my understanding, obviously, I'm not a geneticist or a virologist or anything like that, but this dates back, this type of test, as I understand it, dates back to the days of AIDS research, when they were trying to find out more about what caused this alleged AIDS, condition, or not the alleged condition, because people did have something corresponding to what was described as AIDS, but they were trying to isolate if it was caused by a virus. And there's a chap called Kari Mullis, and I think he won the Nobel Prize. I mean, people can check on these things because I don't have the information directly in front of me, but I have put some of this into the report that I wrote, which is on the cvpandemicinvestigation.com website that I put together. And so basically, this is a test where you take a small amount of material from, say, a swab. I don't know if they do it with blood, but I think it's mainly from saliva or other similar bodily fluid. And then you run it through, you mix it with some chemicals, and then you repeat this test. I think it's like electrophoresis or some derivative of that, which is used in chemistry to determine if a sample contains a certain substance, in this case, an RNA sequence. And what you do is you amplify it. So I think what the actual chemicals do is they encourage this material to create copies of itself or to be duplicated. And then when there's enough of it, I think it gives a coloured indication, which I think is blue in this case. So you'll have a little piece of paper or slide, which will give you a blue coloration, which will give you a positive result. But the thing is, this is an iterative process. So you can it's kind of like growing bacteria on an agar plate, in that you may have this bacteria or you may not, but you might only see it if you allow it to grow for 4 hours rather than 1 hour. And apparently you can run this test for a recommended number of iterations, but if you don't run it for the recommended number of iterations, it'll give you either a false negative or a false positive. And this is what has been the case. So it is said to give an 80% false positive test in the papers that have been published studying how this particular test works have shown that it gives an 80% false positive test, false positive rate. And so that's just on their own numbers, really. But if you also look at what it's actually meant to detect, it's just meant to detect an RNA sequence, in other words, a sequence of protein in your saliva. It doesn't tell you really where this protein came from. It could have naturally been in your body already because you've had, for example, a previous vaccination, or you've had ingested a previous substance that somehow got and created an immune response in your body, which has caused you to have this protein. So all it means is you've got this protein sequence in your system. It doesn't mean that you're ill. It doesn't mean that you're going to infect somebody. And it was the same with AIDS. People can test HIV positive, but they're still not a risk to anybody. Even if they're having sex with somebody, they're not a risk. Pregnant women can test HIV positive. That's quite common. You can look that up.
Well, it's interesting that the guy behind all this, Anthony Fauci, in America, who's pushing the vaccines and the testing, etc., was one of the biggest culprits behind the AIDS pandemic back in the 80s, and was basically had people believing that AIDS was the same as HIV and that everybody was going to die. So history does indeed repeat itself. Bruce, I know you shared a few articles with us today, and one I was particularly interested in was the T cells, and that a lot of people are showing evidence that is present with the antibody, which is making it easier for us to fight off the infection, and more people than originally thought might have these, which means essentially, have we reached herd immunity now?
Yeah, I mean, the T cell immunity obviously is, it can give actually longer term immunity than antibodies. So essentially your body's already primed to fight off the virus, and that's turning out to be fairly widespread. I saw one study, and I think where they randomly tested a small group of people, and around about 50% seem to have this T cell response. So you think about that, that's like pretty huge. If that extends out into the general population, and we know already from, and I think we might have touched on this before, but we know already that in several cases where there was infections on boats, where there should have been, let's say 80%, 90% infection of the people. Instead, there was around 20, and that happened on the U.S. military ships. That happened on the cruise ships. That's happened in cities. We've had that in London, in Stockholm, and in other major cities. But this 20% keeps coming up. Now, it seems that the other 80% of people, it's a mixture of T cell response, and I think that's probably the biggest one. If it really is 50% of people or somewhere like that, then that explains a lot of those 80% that aren't getting it. And then on top of that, it turns out there's also, I think, something called B cells as well, which they mentioned. So some people have this B cell response, and others just seem to be perhaps have some kind of genetic variance in the population, where you have some people whose genome is different, and for whatever reason, they are not a prime candidate for infection. Now, we don't necessarily know why that is, but their system is not easy for this virus to infect. So we have a range of reasons for why we would see this. So I think that in the major cities, we probably already have, if not total herd immunity, certainly we have herd immunity effects already occurring, where the virus sort of crashes away down to just these pockets of infection in areas where it hadn't reached. But really, the epidemic is over in those areas.
Yeah. I think. Go on, Andrew. Go on.
Well, I was just going to say, all the evidence that we have, whether you look at the number of test results, whether you look at the number of deaths, all of it, as far as I'm aware, shows that this is not a problem. The only problem is the one that the media and the government have created throughout the world. The actual clinical and health problems are not next to non-existent, or rather no different from other seasonal flus. I think everything that I've read and studied over the last 6 months now, just about, shows that it is the worst thing about it is that this flu, or whatever it is that's supposedly going around, if you think it's an infection, causes more damage to those who are already ill than in previous years. So those that have got a lung condition generally have come off rather worse and have died more than in previous years, and that's about it. The actual effect on the likes of people like us who are still relatively young and healthy and have no respiratory problems or no serious respiratory problems, it's just not an issue. It's not an issue. Should never have been put into this category. And going back, just to add one thing onto the test, I meant to get to mention, it didn't very quickly, was that the inventor said that this is a qualitative test. It doesn't, in other words, if you've got this infection, it doesn't tell you how badly you're infected. It doesn't measure that, even if you take into account that you could get seriously infected. It doesn't measure that at all. And he said that it should never be used for clinical work. It was purely a research tool. That's what he, to see, he was using it for research, like when he was mixing things together and seeing what substances had gone where and that type of thing. He wasn't using it as a way of judging whether somebody was a danger because they'd become infected.
Right. Yeah, well, that's absolutely right. And another thing, Bruce, I noticed again, you made a good post on Facebook. For anyone that doesn't follow Bruce and Andrew on Facebook, please just, they're not going to bite. Just add them on Facebook and you can see some of the things that they share, because it is interesting stuff. Bruce, you spoke about the figures that are slowly being dropped off. They've ever so quietly got rid of 1.3 million test results. They took the 5,000 off the 46,000 total, so we were down to 41. And what I found fascinating was how you spoke about it was rumoured that roughly 20,000 were died in care homes. So that leaves us with another 20,000. So that's it. So we've gone from 46 down to 20 in the general population. And out of that 20,000, it was something like they believe at least a third of, 2/3 might have had underlying health issues. Either way, it got us down to like 1,500, which lined up with what NHS England was saying, where they reckoned about 1,300 or so actually died directly of COVID. Didn't actually, nothing else. It was just COVID that killed them. Everyone else had an underlying health issue, or they were in a care home, or they tested positive and then got mauled by a dog 2 weeks later. One of those. So it's interesting. Do you see? Because one thing I've said to you is that the media seems to be swinging around to our side now, ever so slowly. So the article I just mentioned with the T cells and the antibodies, pushing for more figures to be dropped off. Do you see light at the end of the tunnel?
In terms of the media, yes. There's definitely a sea change. Well, there's exceptions, and you'll notably see in the UK. One of the big exceptions, of course, the BBC, which have become completely a government mouthpiece. I mean, they've been bad over the years, but I mean now it's become so transparent that I think a lot of people that would have in past years said, don't be absurd. The BBC is an independent media. Now are realizing that it's anything but. And then the other one that's been particularly bad, I think, was the Guardian. And if you look who Guardian Health News is sponsored by, you'll notice that they will have that it's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that sponsors their medical and health news. So funnily enough, we now have the BBC and the Guardian that are both completely biased towards the existing narrative and just are not changing direction, right? So no surprises there. But elsewhere, we've seen some interesting stories in Sky News, pointing out that the World Economic Forum are trying to trash the global economy. That was surprising to see. We've had RT, that they had a really good article which just dismantled the whole thing, saying that 5 biggest kind of ridiculous aspects of this, and they went through the whole thing, breaking down that, you know, we talked about flattening the curve. Obviously, that's been now morphed into this eradication idea. And they go through, you know, the idea that we need to slow it all down when there's no basis, if it's not really causing hospitalizations. And so, you know, they really that really broke it down. We've had that, and we've had, as you say, the Telegraph has done quite a few now where they've gone through dismantling parts of the government story and saying, look, you know, they're quite clear that Sweden's done better than us, that the lockdown has been a disaster, it's destroyed the country. Even the Times has been on it. The Times has said, look, you know, it seems like it's pretty much over, that, you know, there's no hospitalizations anymore, that we're down by like 99% in hospitalization. You know, at what point do we say, if we call it a day and say this is over? And so a lot of the media, you know, to be honest, you could have said at the beginning, but a lot of the media are turning around and saying this is over. Look, this doesn't make any sense anymore. I think that's pressure from their readership. You know, I do think that they're seeing people say, you know, the media's the virus. That people are sick of being lied to, and those are the people that buy their papers, the people that pay for adverts. You know, the companies who are being destroyed are the big advertisers in those newspapers. I mean, there has to be a point where they remember they're also a business, you know, not just a propaganda machine. They need that money from us and from those businesses. So what will be left for them? And at the end of it, I mean, what do they want to end up on the gallows or something? I mean, they have to remember that, you know, people will know who was telling the truth and who was devastating this country, you know, who was involved in it. So I think that's the sea change we're seeing, but it's not necessarily enough to end it, because if the government just steamrolls over the media as it has the people and the voters, so then it doesn't make a huge impact. So we'll have to see. It may come down to whether MPs individually think, oh, next year we're going to have these local elections, am I going to get booted out? I mean, that's probably about the only thing that may concern them, but they luckily have shifted that election back to next year sometime. And will they do that again? Maybe they are already talking about shifting that further back, for all we know, so that they'll be bloody in there until this you know is over. The theatre show is over, and if they can keep the theatre show going, there won't be an election, right? So we're just stuck with them, and we're stuck with their decision-making process. So that's the concern people should have: is can they just go on like this, pushing back the elections and stuff?
Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, that's interesting, Bruce. Yeah, no, very. I really am quite. I feel really physically sick when I get mainstream stuff put in front of me, and I feel dirty if I click on a link to the Times or the Guardian. And in that respect, I'm not, you know, trying to diss anybody. It's just how I feel. I feel, and I felt this way for years, not just because of what's happened now, because I know the sorts of things they've covered up. And just to go back to the Guardian for a moment, and we talked about climate change. That's the Guardian is a very good example of being a climate change mouthpiece, more so than the other papers are. And going back to what you said about readership, I think that's all valid. And I think it's interesting to hear you say that, because it's not something I've looked at and tried to assess. So that's really interesting to me. But I agree with what you said, that it's difficult to see that, you know, they're like, I think, you know, I'm paraphrasing what you said, they're getting backed into a corner now. And the question is how deep is that corner, and what's going to happen when they get there? You know, is the government going to, as you say, come in and do all the things, which is, you know, what's going on in places like New Zealand, at least on paper, is frightening. And are we going to see similar things here? So how's that all going to play out? And I don't think anybody's really knows that yet. And we don't know what sort of power struggles are going on behind closed doors. And that sort of, if there are any, or even if there are any, because nobody talks about these things openly. But, you know, I wrote an article 2, 3, 4 weeks ago called Investing in the Lie, and just looking at the experience, because, of course, we've got to remember that it's not just the media that have invested in the lie. It's this sort of 50, 60, 70% of people wearing face masks, who maybe some of them, you know, don't know it's a scam. Like when we were at Birmingham on Saturday, I was talking to one youngish chap, probably in his 20s, I think. And he was kind of a bit in the middle with it all. You know, he'd looked at stuff, but he hadn't heard of Event 201. But he had looked at some of the other stuff, you know, and I was having a bit of a conversation about him, and he was kind of playing devil's advocate with the Event 201, and he didn't really think that was suspicious, but I didn't really have time to explain it all to him, you know. So we've got people like that that chap that I was speaking to, they're in the middle of all this. Which way are they going to go? So it's obviously very hard for people and the media. Are the media going to be, oh God, we've helped a global criminal network commit mass murder? Are they going to really admit that, or admit something which leads people towards knowing that that's what indeed they are doing and have been doing, in fact, for years? So at this point, I think we'd all agree it could go either way. And whilst
I think there's two subjects I really want to tackle tonight, and the one is talking about, I guess, the future and where we're going to go with this, and the COVID passports that keep being brought up all the time, these immunity passports. But before we get to that, I'm finding it really interesting when we think about like this kind of transition period now, and I know that next month in September the government are meeting to vote for extensions to the coronavirus bill, which have been enacted now for 6 months, and they want to extend it for a further 2 years. So someone's commented here, they're not going to admit it's over because of their other agendas. And of course, there are a lot of agendas, and it is it's a dot connector, really. It's not a single thing that's going on here. It's not just black and white. And not a lot of people watching this will probably be aware that the government are meeting to vote to extend this coronavirus bill. Now, this bill was brought in illegally, as far as bringing in bills are concerned. It was rushed through, and it was literally just pulled out of the drawer, almost as if it had been already written up long before this pandemic occurred. They just happened to have it there to hand. Oh, it blew Peter. Here's one I made earlier. And what they're voting to do is scandalous in terms of children. They're doing it in New Zealand now, taking people away from their families, putting them in quarantine centres. So I just want to make people watching this aware that this is going on. Now, will we have a say over this? No. This isn't like a Brexit or a referendum or anything like that. We won't have a say. So all we can do is write to politicians, write to our local authorities, and make them aware that we don't agree with this and we don't want this to happen. However, if it does, Bruce, what does that hold for the future of our country?
Well, if they go ahead with this 2 years and they keep this thing going, well, in the direction that it's heading, and if you look at New Zealand and Australia, and they kind of give us a little bit of step ahead. But if you look beyond that, you have to look at China. I mean, you have to start looking at this kind of society with social credits, where you are constantly monitored, so your social credits are being impacted by your behaviour. There's been talk, not just in China, but talk in Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere, of being fined for giving opinions out that are unacceptable. That this idea of the fake news, if you're spreading information that is considered not the main line, that you'll be fined. I mean, so talk about shutting down the conversation. That would likely be brought in fairly rapidly. They've been talking about that for a few months now in the background. So you can imagine the shutting this down. We're being booed off of YouTube and everywhere else. So in the end, you'll be getting fined just for commenting in a negative way against the government's opinions on this. They'll say, the World Health Organization says it's like this, you've said something counter, £50 fine, and it'll probably be taken straight off of your universal income or whatever, and a social credit knocked off. I mean, that's the kind of system that will be wheeled in, and it'll be wheeled in frighteningly fast, because the fact is it's already been trialed in China and other places. So it's not something they need to build from scratch where you don't know how it works. It's being experimented with. They've got a working model. That can roll out quick. The technology is there already to bring that all out. I mean, we're one of the most surveilled nations in the world already. So it's not a huge leap to then get those, the camera systems working on that, on that greater project of having this kind of Black Mirror dystopian society where your neighbors are calling the police. We've already had that. Neighbors calling because you're having a barbecue and you shouldn't have had your friends. That's all been happening. If people want that going forward as their future, I mean, just sit back and let it all happen, because that's the direction it's going in. It doesn't bear thinking about. And to be honest, if you were to explain the whole thing, from the perspectives of people like ourselves, people that spend a lot of their time looking at where all this goes, to try and summarize where it's going within the next half an hour, you just sound like a raving lunatic, because there's so much to it, and some of it's so extraordinary that you would need hours and hours and hours to explain to someone, what is actually happening in the bigger picture. That's the reality. I mean, we're just giving them a slice of what's going on.
Well, I like to think that we're we're a gateway, really. I mean, because we do only have an hour. And
Yeah.
I know a lot of people, I'm seeing so many people on my social media who would never in a million years have shared anything to do with conspiracies. And over the past month or so, they are beginning to share posts. They're beginning to like my posts. They're beginning to comment on my posts. And I think there is a change in the air. But I just want to point out there, and I know this will bring you in, Andrew, that in China, one of the social crediting systems, which always makes me laugh, is they have a green, amber, and red system. So you're either a green citizen, amber citizen, or red citizen, depending on what you've done. Oh, you've been out protesting this weekend, so you're going to be downgraded to amber, so you can only spend so much money this week. Because, of course, when it's cashless society, that's what will happen. They actually have roads in China that you can only drive down if you are a green citizen. Now, people watching this, look into this. I'm not making this up. This isn't a conspiracy. There are roads that you can only have access to if you are a green-coded citizen. And this is really where this is going.
Yeah. I mean, we kind of have that a little bit, like when you said that. I wasn't aware of what you just said, but what it made me think of is, and I think it's actually been moved now, but I used to drive up to Yorkshire quite a bit. I haven't been so much recently, but when you drive on to the M62 from Bradford, there's a 2+ lane, and you could only go in it if you had two or more people in your car. So that's kind of because you're being environmentally friendly because you've got a passenger, where you're giving somebody lift, so you can go on this bit of road, and that's like the logical extension with that would be what you said. But yeah, we could discuss what the future is going to be like, but then again, as people have already said, watch 1984, watch Minority Report, watch the Divergent films, watch any of these other dystopian movies, 28 Days and all of that, with all these zombies walking around, I think it is at the end or whatever. I guess get some of these films mixed up. So in other words, Hollywood has given us clues as to what the potential future could be if such measures as what Bruce was talking about, we've been discussing, were brought in. And like you said about the Coronavirus Act, 300 pages long, that had clearly been pre-written up.
Yep.
If not in January, then, January is probably about the latest they could have done it, really. When let's just say, it broke in China, we hadn't got it over here yet, and then they started writing it just in case,
But that's not the kind of thing that you write just in case, is it?
You don't exactly. No, you're absolutely right. I'm trying to give people the benefit of the doubt, so to speak. So, like the Patriot Act in the US, which was 1,000 pages long, and that was bang, 3 days after 9/11, that was passed, or whatever the date was. You're talking about the same sort of scenario here, and it is one of a global Marxist or fascist dictatorship based on, in this case, they were maybe going to try and do it on an environmentalism basis, but they thought, well, that's not really going to work. We need something a bit more all-encompassing. No, let's choose health. Let's choose. It's got to be. Can't do it with like cancer or anything like that. Oh, I know, it'll be a virus because that's something anyone can catch. So we can catch anyone with that. In other words, to put it that way. So, you can see that they need this sort of scam, and they need people to believe in the idea of infectious disease, which, of course, if you look at some other research by people like Dr. Andrew Kaufman and Arthur Furstenberg, I think, has written about this in past times. Wilhelm Reich, going back into the 1930s, he never believed in what he called the air germ theory, in this idea that germs travel through the air and infect other people. And that all dates back to, we may have touched on this before, Pasteur and Béchamp. Béchamp, he said that there was no such thing as infectious disease. It was all to do with toxins in the environment and those that were transmitted. In other words, toxic chemicals and the terrain in which they land. In other words, your body and what state of health you're in generally. Have you got good nutrition, good diet, good state of mind, etc., or are you just a bit of a wreck? So there's all those factors, and so if you end up at the extreme, you end up challenging the whole of the basis of much of Western medicine, really, when you look into all of this, and that's one of the big problems. I know we've gone off, going back into the past a bit rather than the future, but then also to tie on to what Bruce said, look at the technocracy agenda And that was talked about in the 1930s, what the technocrats wanted to do. And there's I think, a Technocracy Live website, which has got a lot of good information on technocracy now. I think it's Patrick Wood that's done a lot of work on this, the technocrats agenda. And that all kind of ties into the Agenda 21 and smart cities, everyone's surveilled, everyone's tracked, everything's rationed in one way or another. You know, this is what they're saying that they're going to do with the next lockdown. They're going to start, you know, going to roll out some stupid scenario where everything gets locked down and then you go to food rationing.
Yeah.
And there was another interesting video that I watched this week. In fact, yesterday, I've just posted a link to it on my CV Pandemic website about an Austrian lady who watched Hitler come to power. And I think this video was shot in about 2010. So I think she was probably in sort of mid-80s, early 90s or something. And she describes all the steps of the implementation of, you know, Hitler's regime over a period of perhaps a couple of years. You know, and they all got paid by the government. They were all given free radios. And I think in the US, they were giving out free smartphones fairly recently. I've picked up on a report of that to some, you know, to homeless people. Or something, or people who had very, very poor. So and that was a direct parallel to what the Nazis did by giving out free radios. And I never heard of that before, but of course it makes perfect sense when they wanted to get the propaganda out to people, give them a radio. You know, it's obvious, isn't it? So. You know, you can watch that to see the parallels with what's unfolding now. Yes, it's looking back into the past, but it's also, I think, looking into the future as well.
Yeah, I think people that are watching this, if you're new to this, because this kind of airs live on a paranormal page, really, which is really my background, but then it does go out after to a wider audience. So the guys that are watching this. Please research Agenda 21, or as it's now known, Agenda 2030. Everything that we're discussing here is involved with that. And the next thing I want to move on to is the COVID passports, really. These kind of immunity passports that we keep seeing bandied around. And were actually mentioned as early as back in March. I think Matt Hancock was talking about it back in March, you know, so we talk about these things being predetermined and pre-planned. Just a quick side note, someone mentioned the other day, about 2 weeks before masks were made mandatory, people began to notice something suspicious, and that was their local supermarkets were taking up the one-way systems, and they were getting rid of some of the social distancing measures that they'd put in place. And people were quite elated. They were thinking, oh, does that mean it's over? Of course not. What it meant was they were getting ready for the mandatory masks. And that happened 2 weeks before masks were actually made mandatory. So when they come on TV and say, oh, this has been a difficult decision over the past couple of days, excuse my French, but that's bollocks. They've known about this for weeks. They tell you that it's a tough decision they've made over a couple of days. But, you know, my local Tesco must have had it from the top. Get rid of all your arrows, get rid of your social distancing, because masks are going to be mandatory. So they know about this for such a long time. Now, the other thing they've clearly got in the works is this COVID passport. I think Bill Gates has even been quoted as saying, you know, you don't have a choice. You either have to have this vaccine or you're not going to live a normal life. You won't be able to go and watch pop concerts. You won't be able to go to watch your favourite sports team, go on holiday, anything like that. And what it will create is a two-tier society. Civilians that have had their passport and they're good to go, they're green citizens if they were in China, and the other people who haven't had their vaccine, so they can't go on holiday, they can't, you know, and what you'll get is you'll get shops that will allow those people in and won't allow the other types in, and you will have this two-split society. It reminds me of Demolition Man with Sylvester Stallone and the people that live underground and the people that live above ground. That's how I see it going. Bruce, do you think this COVID passport is certainly something that's going to make an appearance?
Yeah, I think what they're giving you there is kind of a precursor, initiation into the idea of a society that has these tiers, in the way that, you know, we've talked on there, that, you know, instead of having the social credits, we're not quite there yet. Instead, it's getting you used to the idea that there are some people that will have more access to the system due to compliance and going along with the narrative, and also it may be that some people with antibodies or whatever get too. But, you know, essentially the underlying message is to get ready to accept the idea of, you know, different tiers of access to the society ahead of rolling out a real kind of Chinese style where it'll be much broader. Because it's always mission creep. Don't worry. At first, it's just going to be these passports. It's because some of you won't have the vaccine. And then later on, it's, well, we've realized it's a great system. Now it's going to be, you're going to have all these credits. We'll work out individually for, who can do this and who can do that. So, we have to be careful. There's a mission creep the whole way through with this. So I think that we will see those. They will certainly come out in a few countries. We'll have to see how widely they're accepted globally, how much resistance there are. But I think we're definitely going to see those going into action in some places. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, and Andrew?
Yeah, I tend to agree with Bruce. Unfortunately, I can't, like Bruce said, I put this in the report that I wrote about the immunity passports, and it was, I think, a week or two after the lockdown had been, started. So it's always on the cards, and, like the actual act itself, it had been probably planned. And going back to the event, the censorship issues and stuff, that was all in the Event 201 exercise. They actually talked in their video, and you can go and watch their video about how they would shut down parts of the internet to stop people spreading misinformation, So is that on the cards? Probably is, because, we're going to, people like us who are doing this sort of thing now, we're going to become persona non grata. We're going to become, as you say, the amber citizens or the red citizens, the underclass, the underdogs, or whatever you want to call them, the people in Blake 7 who live outside the Dome City, and the or the people in Logan's Run that are outside the Dome City, that are allowed to live after beyond the age of 30. That's another dystopian film, Logan's Run, if people have not seen that. So, I think that is what they're trying to do. That's clearly what they're trying to do. And I think what for me, and maybe for yourselves, is most shocking, that so many of these politicians seem to be going along with it. They don't seem, we're stating some pretty obvious things here. They're really shocking. They're totally against what we've been brought up with. That for example, you've had social services, for example, all through our lives are meant to protect children. Now, in theory, they can take them out of the home, according to what we've been reading in the laws, just on a whim almost. Oh, you've got this random test which doesn't work, which produces a random result, and on the basis of that, they can be taken away from a family. So what is the goal is to break up the family, the state interference in your life. That's all it can be. It can't be anything else. And the shocking thing is that the intelligentsia of society, aren't seeing this. They're not reacting to it. They're so afraid, of their losing their jobs or whatever, that they're letting it happen. They're letting it happen. And of course, it's shocking to think about this. And we say, well, that couldn't happen. That couldn't happen. That's not happening, Andrew. That couldn't happen in our modern enlightened society. It couldn't happen. It's not going to happen. It couldn't happen. Well, it happened in Nazi Germany, and that wasn't ever so long ago. Okay, we didn't have the level of communication that we've got now, and that's about the only difference, I think. The only difference we've got now is we've got much better, forms of communication that we can use, such as what we're doing now, and that wasn't possible back in the 1930s and 40s. But other than that, the circumstances are remarkably similar.
Yeah, and I think you've made a good point there that the what we have nowadays is a magical thing called the internet, and you get some complete and utter rubbish on it, and you get some fantastic things like this show. And when our parents, or when my parents were growing up in particular, all they had really was the radio and the TV. So all they were fed was the mainstream narrative. They never had a choice, really. And this is evident when you see old people now who go to shops with masks on, who probably aren't aware that there are exemptions, because it's not advertised freely. It's not on the TV. It's not on the shop windows. And the only reason people know about this is because they have the internet and they're able to talk to each other and share news. And that's because we have this great thing now in order to do this. That's where the censorship comes in. That's why we are having people like, Dr. Adil being suspended for 12 months after 35 years of service in the medical industry. He's now being suspended because he speaks out about this. Pure and utter censorship. However, I will say that in this day and age, ignorance is a choice. When you have information to see all of this stuff, ignorance is indeed a choice. And I'd just like to throw out a good comparison I saw the other day, and it said that the people that were hiding Anne Frank were the lawbreakers, and the people who killed her were obeying the law. And that's just something to remember with the direction that we're going in the very near future, really. So that's the kind of the social credit system and the COVID passports. The other big thing that's looming over us, and we've touched on it briefly before, and that's that of cashless society, and how that is so much part of the control system. So you go into a shop with some cash to buy a loaf of bread to feed your family, and they turn you down. You go, fine, I'll use my card. You pay with your card. If your card is denied, if it doesn't work because you've been a naughty boy that week, how are you going to feed your family? You're so much easier to control. And of course, there's talk about what happened in Cyprus. I think it was Cyprus or Greece, where the government took everybody's savings. Is it a bail-in instead of a bailout? Right. So they can take all of your savings to help pay back everything that they've furloughed people with. So cashless society, Bruce, is this something that scares you as much as it scares me?
Yeah, I mean, look, it goes hand in glove with all this other stuff, doesn't it? That, you know, once they've got that control, you know, once they're monitoring you, they're giving you these credits, they can turn you off. You know, once that's all comes together, yeah, the cashless society bit is a kind of a clincher, isn't it? Because then, you know, like you say, you won't be able to go and get the things you need. You know, they can, you know, have that threat hanging over you. And I've had someone say something to me before already that they were worried about doing something because their universal credit might get affected. So I mean, whether that's true or not, I think that's already in people's minds, the idea that, well, I better not because I'm on government money, Bruce, so I can't really say anything, you know, in case the government turns off my universal credit. So I think people are already starting to sense that feeling that, and look how many people are on universal credit now, so you're getting acclimatized to that. And then, you know, once it gets to the stage there is no cash involved, there's that sense, could your, you know, the agent in the universal credit just push a button, turn you off, you know, and because you did something wrong and the government found out, you know, that it could be implied quite easily to people that, you know, well, you know, if you're not being a good citizen, that could happen. So they probably wouldn't do anything. So, you know, it's an easy one, isn't it, really, to get people that threat that your children won't be able to eat. You know, your partner will be asking what's happened to the money. You know, you've got to say, well, I posted a link on Facebook, you know, to get to, you know, yeah. So it should scare people. It should, you know, and I'm not, you know, I don't want people to always come away from these talks as being, you know, crap in their pants. But I mean, you have to be able to look ahead to these things and say, well, if you let that happen, then yeah, it's very frightening. But at any point along this journey, it's relatively simple to stop. All of these things, they're relatively simple to stop because the population has the numbers, has the control. But as long as we give that control away and we just let the government steamroller along, and, you know, WHO, Gates, whoever, you let this conglomerate of psychos and morons, you know, kind of steamroll forward, then yeah, you'll end up with these horribly scary situations, which will make the worst of the dystopian movies look like comedies, you know.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, the only sort of thing that I'd add to, well, a couple of things I'd add to that is I'd read somewhere, and I've not really checked the law, that if you go into a shop and offer them cash and they refuse, you can take the goods because they've been offered, you know, cash.
Legal tender.
They've refused legal tender currency, so you can just walk away with it without getting a criminal charge. That's what I'd read. I mean, again, I'd need to check that because it's not something I would do. And, you know, I think this is where you feel a bit kind of trapped because I'm probably much like most of the other listeners and readers of this, that, you know, I have a credit card, I have a debit card and stuff. I have run through everything through a bank account. Don't actually use cash all that much. And, you know, I just find the card more convenient. And this is one of the other things that where we've been caught up in the system. Oh, it's much more convenient. We don't want to lose our cash and, you know, to go out with £500, you know, when we want to buy an expensive item and drop it in the street, or lose our wallet and lose all that money. You know, you don't want to do, I don't want to do that. And I've been doing that for years. I use a card, you know, and then you think, oh, you know, what Bruce has just said, you think, yeah, I mean, that maybe I've contributed to that. And, you know, it's not like feeling guilty about it, but, you know, it makes me think more, you know, have I made the right choices in life in the past? You know, you can't regret the past too much, but you can see how it's all, you know, been guiding you down the sort of rat's maze or whatever to this new bit of the maze where you're cornered in more, you know, and and I certainly think, certain people I know that have literally have gone off grid. They've dropped out of the system. I have a relative of mine that basically he worked in bushcraft, and he pretty much camps in the woods most of his life. He spent a fair proportion of camping in the woods for his life, and you think, well, maybe I ought to think about doing that, and you're unplugged from the system then. But perhaps just speaking personally for a minute, I'm probably like a lot of other people. I like my creature comforts, the little things, having a hot shower and, access to easy access to food. I don't want to have to go out and dig potatoes out of the ground, when it's pissing down rain. I'm not that sort of person,
No.
I know a few people that are, but I'm certainly not like that. I don't even like going camping, for heaven's sake, but even nash about that. So, so when you get hooked into the system, I'm digressing a bit, then you get hooked into it, and it's difficult then to kind of, divorce yourself from it without making a lot of sacrifices. And that's not really a sort of fear thing. It's more of a kind of, oh God, I'm just fed up with it all. You just get fed up with it. It's not like I'm really scared of it or scared of losing that. I just think, well, it's just going to be such hard work if I have to start growing my own food and stuff. And then you come into lots of other things. But and this whole thing with Bitcoin as well, how is that going to pan out? Because this is something I ponder about with the Bitcoin stuff and all the cryptocurrencies. Is this something which is truly independent of the banks, which is what is claimed, or are we being led into a system where we just have a digital money system with no cash? Because of course Bitcoin is by definition, there's no actual cash. It's all done through your smartphone, through an app. You're going to need an internet connection to access that system.
They know where you are, IP address.
They know where you are. I mean, again, you can shield yourself with VPN things and stuff like that. But even so, it's a digital system. So whatever even though Bitcoin is decentralized and all this blockchain technology and stuff, it is still nevertheless a digital system. You are reliant, for example, on having an energy system to power your smartphone. You're reliant on a mobile phone operator, and like we said, they could delete your mobile phone account if you were deemed to be a criminal, because you'd say they made, as Bruce has alluded to, posting certain Facebook links or certain information. Say that was made a criminal offence. And your mobile phone company would be prosecuted by the government or whoever for supporting criminal activity. Then they'd say, "Oh, we're not going to do that." It's a bit like these shops. It's an extreme version of the shops not wanting to open for worry of people being prosecuted for not wearing face masks or whatever, or not following the regulations. I was hoping that more businesses say, "No, I'm not going that government stuff. I'm not going to force people to wear face masks." But a lot of them are doing it, and that includes some small businesses.
They have
as well.
to, though. They have to, because they won't earn money. I mean, let's be honest.
Well, no, that's what I mean. That's the very point, though. They don't have to, because it's not really a law when you look at it. It's a recommendation, but they feel that they have to, because otherwise they're going to get penalised. So that's, again, that's all part of the program. So, that the mask idea can then be extended to the COVID passport and then to the vaccine. So we've already seen it with the masks. So we're as somebody said on these videos, it's only a mask, it's only a passport, it's only a vaccine, it's only a credit system that that is, if you're a good boy, it'll work fine for you, and it's all those steps.
It's literally just it's a step-by-step totalitarian tiptoe, as David Icke called it. That noise you can hear in the background for those watching are my frogs. I apologise. It's the last time I feed them before I come on live. They're having an absolute feeding frenzy over there with their flies. And I think it is mating season as well. I've noticed a couple of them chasing after each other.
I was going to add on a little comment there as well on that, with the relevant to what we were just talking about, is that, again, if people are listening and they think, come on, guys, it's absurd to say that they're going to bring in things like, laws that if I put a post on Facebook, I could get a caution, with the police, or I could get a fine. Come on, it's absurd. Please. You can now get a fine for going to Tesco's without having a surgical mask on. Like, think in your head, like how far that's done. Right? So
exactly. In 6 months, less.
in less than 6 months. So the idea that it's absurd that you're going to find yourself getting a police caution for posting on Facebook is no longer extraordinary. So, I mean, you've really got to think how surreal this can get. And the fact that, like you say, New Zealand, the leader was laughing when people say, what about if someone doesn't get tested in these camps? And she just laughed and said, well, they won't leave. They'll just stay in the camp. I mean, we've got to that where there's camps where your family are dragged to, in what was considered to be one of those liberal, free nations in the world, with their leader laughing, saying she'll just keep you in a camp until you go along what they say, and that, for just testing positive in a test where you might not even have anything. And that's happened. That's happening now. So nothing is absurd anymore. Nothing is absurd anymore. Don't go thinking, well, that can't happen.
One thing I'll add to a little story regarding the Facebook posting, because there's a chap that I know who lives in South Yorkshire, and he made a joke that there was I think it was when there was a riot kicking off somewhere in the world, in the US or somewhere, and this is fairly recent, like in the last 3 years, I think, and he just put a joke on Facebook, says, let's go and have a riot in Sheffield, and then half an hour later or 2 hours later, his coppers showed up at his door.
Right.
And he said, no, it's just a joke. And I know this guy, and I know he wouldn't have made that up, So they must have known where he lived or found out where he lived, and somebody's either reported that post or they've somehow tracked it.
Yeah. I did just flash this up because it's something I wanted to discuss. How so I don't know who's put this because it just says Facebook user, but they could go one step further and preload your credit. Now, Bruce, you touched on universal credit. Now, they're getting rid of jobs left, right, and centre. People are not earning any money now. People are getting used to furloughed, sitting around on their asses, not doing anything while the taxpayer essentially pays their wage. If this happens, we even have people like the Pope calling out for a universal credit. Now, on the face of it, this is a fantastic thing to happen. It's a socialist dream where, people get paid for not doing anything. It boosts the economy. However, what it also does is it makes you 100% reliant on the government. They can give with one hand and they can damn well take away with the other. And if they choose to, they will, and you're left with nothing. And so I think universal credit is a bad thing. I really do, because we're going to make businesses, we're going to make whole industries go bust, essentially. And people are going to be sitting around not doing anything while they're earning a living wage, I guess, which could just be stopped at the drop of a hat. I mean, is that something you see happening?
Well, the problem is as well that what might start off as a living wage with it, once you've got these systems going, you can make it to the just not living wage. You can start to step down and say, well, there's not enough money to keep this going as it is. We don't want people to quite starve, but, it's going to be a bit less than you were getting this month. Next month's going to be, before you know it, you're just alive. That's the problem. Is once you're on it and they've got control, there's no guarantee it's going to stay as a living wage. And that, again, and that's where the threats will come in. There's a little bit of something wrong, and that's enough to make a difference. So you didn't eat on Friday, so you've got to be aware of that. I mean, I'm not against the principle of in some respects, a universal income. If we had some sort of benevolent, society where we really trusted our leaders, and that, that we have this line where no one falls below this, or even on the basis that, look, we all have, there are things which are for the common people. You could say if you find gold, coal, or whatever, to some degree that should go to the people, right? So you could say there's an income that everyone gets some derivative of the profits of the country. All those kind of ideas are fine if you have a benevolent society. Then on top of that, the people work, they earn extra money. That's fine. But I'm not against those kind of ideas. But this is obviously not that. This is being used as a control system.
I think absolutely, and like a lot of these things and political ideologies and stuff. The problem with them is that the people, when they get in power and get higher up, they become corrupt.
Yeah.
And it's based, what we see now, some of the measures and stuff would be great. They'll be justified. But we know they're based on lies. They're based on deception. And they won't admit the deception. So a lot of these systems will only work properly if the people running them are honest and truthful. And history shows, going back thousands of years, they're not. They may start off with good intentions, and the old saying, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions." And just to sort of finish that point, really, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it seems that certain of these people, like for example, George Soros was one that immediately comes to mind. They have absolute power, certainly in the domain in which they're operating. So that I would say the evidence shows that they are absolutely corrupt, and we can't rely on them to, for example, implement a fair social credit system, even if we wanted it.
No.
Go back to what the Austrian woman was saying on this video. Is they introduced a system where they just taxed all the rich people to the point where their income became the same as the standard income. So in other words, anything other than the sort of designated standard income was taken off them in tax, and that's how they spread out the wealth. Now, some people might say that that's fair. But you can't just come in and take everyone's life savings that they've worked for and then just redistribute it randomly. Our society is not like that.
No.
Is that what they're planning to implement with the Great Reset next year? With the World Economic Forum bringing the Great Reset, which is what they've been banding about for the last few months. In fact, I think they posted that on the website the day after the pandemic was declared or something. I'm probably exaggerating. Not much.
It wasn't far off. I think we've got 4 minutes or so left. For those that are watching, thank you for tuning in. It is quite depressing. We don't kind of sit around before this comes on air and think, right, how can we depress the hell out of everyone that's watching this in an already rather depressing world? There are answers to this, and there are solutions, and there is a light at the end of a very long tunnel. So again, as always, the final word over to you guys. Bruce, if you want to kick us off, what would you suggest to people to give themselves hope, or to try and find that light?
Well, I mean, I'll give you a two-part answer. Firstly, for people to realise that this is transparent deception, here's one very obvious one. I mean, the UK, where we've been repeatedly told more testing is the solution. If you want your life back to normal, more testing. Now, everywhere where the testing increased and people went along with that, the town or city was closed down. Now, you tell me if that was those people getting their lives back to normal, right? They got a second load of lockdown. So you're directly being lied to, where everything's the opposite of what you're told, right? Now, on the second face of it, what can we do to stop it? It's very easy to stop complying so easily. Every step of the way, if there's enough people pushing back, then it doesn't happen. Well, it will at least be slowed down, or it won't happen. If it slows down, that's enough time for other people to say, hang on, look, when people react, this stuff goes backwards. And if people see that, they realize that, there isn't this unstoppable juggernaut, that it's us that allows it to happen.
Yeah. Okay. And Andrew?
Yeah, I think riding onto that back of that, write letters. I've been writing letters. Like, for example, we got this coverage of the event in Birmingham, in the Metro newspaper and in the Birmingham Mail, and I've written to both of the editors of those newspapers to say, look, this is what you put, and this is what actually happened. They actually featured some of my comments in those articles. I said, you didn't even come and talk to me, did you? I said it in a nice way, but pointing out to them, that's just plain rude. You don't just like, oh, who's this dude, saying this and that. They could have come and spoken to me, and that was my little pushback on that one. I've written to my local authority. I've written to the health service. What I'm thinking of doing is putting together some information. I'm going to report the Public Health England for committing fraud, and I'm going to send that to the National Crime Agency once I've got together something which I think is sort of semi-credible. I'm not going to go as far as getting legal advice, but people need to be writing to their authorities, not just to their MPs, because you can do that as well. That's very easy to go to writetothem.com. If you look at my website, they've got letters that I've written. You can copy bits of those, do your own. This is some of the pushback that Bruce was talking about. It doesn't take very long. It might take you, just commit yourself to doing it for an hour, a couple of hours. You can write to me through the website if you want any help. I've had one chap contacted me because he's been writing to his school. He's written to his head teacher. I helped him do that. So, things like that you can do. The other thing as well is thinking about finding out about the bigger picture of human consciousness and things like that, and spirituality, and where you sit with all of that. and the fact that a lot of this is shaped by your reaction to it, not just what's put upon you. It's also important how you react. And as I was watching a video just before we came on, you can control how you react to this. So that's worth thinking about as well. And the other thing we haven't mentioned, which I've become quite interested in, and it may just be a totally sort of false hope, but I've been looking at this QAnon stuff and what's going on with Donald Trump. And opinions a bit divided, but there's certainly a lot of interesting stuff that I've learned about Donald Trump in the last couple of weeks by watching some of these videos. And I've posted a couple of these in some of the updates. Some people say it's all just another, sort of false narrative meant to bring people false hope and stuff. But I'm sort of towards that view a bit, but not totally, So I'd have a look at that and see what you think of it and evaluate it on your own terms.
Okay. I can't really add anything to that. For me, there's a guy called Simon Dolan who's currently raising funds and is trying to basically sue the government for the illegal lockdown and for all the lives that have been lost and the jobs that have been lost. And he's trying to overturn the Coronavirus Act, essentially. So anyone watching this, go and look into Simon Dolan if you haven't already. There are some great movements out there, such as Stand Up X, which we went to the demo for on Saturday. The Save Our Rights, which is headed up by a lady called Louise. There is Us for Them, which I think represents the school children and what's going on at the schools at the moment. If anything, I'd like to just point out to people that I believe that they've taken it one step too far here. And I think what it's allowed us to do as a human race is to actually come together. As much as we're divided between the masks and the non-masks and the vaccines and the anti-vaxxers, it has actually brought us together, and it's given us time in lockdown to find ourselves a bit more and to really notice our capabilities. And all these groups that are springing up, like the Us for Them and the Stand Up X, and all these groups are testament to that we are the many. And I'll end on this. When the hundreds of thousands of people, which there were, that descended on the beaches in the last few bank holidays, and we were warned of a second spike, which never came, by the way. When that happened and the many descended on the beaches, what did they do? They did nothing because they couldn't. Mm-hmm. Because they couldn't. And just remember that. It is really us versus them, and we are the many. I know it's an old cliche, but we are the many. So once again, guys, I'd like to thank Andrew and Bruce for coming on. That's 3 weeks of your time you've given up for me and for the people that are watching this, and that is really appreciated by myself. It's been a great little run, but I think we should really end it on the COVID stuff now. Not long term, no doubt in a few weeks there'll be something else to discuss. But hopefully you've enjoyed coming on, and you will be regular features on the show going forward with different topics and stuff. So thank you very much, guys, for coming on, and thank you as ever to the people tuning in. Thank you to Kieran for allowing us to go live on this platform. And as I say, we will have a week off next week. We're going to come back. I think we're going to get Andrew back on, and Bruce, you're more than welcome back on to discuss climate change. So that'll be something interesting for you guys to tune in next time. Maybe get us away from the depressing world that is COVID. So thank you. So thank you once again, guys. Thank you for everyone watching. Have a good evening and enjoy the rest of your week. Goodbye.
Cheers. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.